Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. And today we're very happy to welcome Mitchell Zuckoff. And he is here to talk about his latest book called Ponzi'sscheme, The True Story of a Financial Legend. And it's published by Random House. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
It's one of those things, everybody's heard the phrase Ponzi scheme and maybe, wondered if someday they'd get involved in one. And in fact, there was been a headline story in the local papers about just such a scheme going down in Marin County and capturing a number of older investors in its in its web. And what your book does is it tells the story of Charles Ponzi, who was, I guess we could say, so good at this kind of thing that it got named after him. And it's a very well-crafted book. And one of the important things that you do is that you describe the time in which Charles Ponzi, if you will, became successful. And the time is the 1920s. Mm-hmm. And it's a time that sounds, very much like our own, where people really want to get rich quick without doing anything. I mean, you open with a story about the money machine.
Yes.
The guy comes in and prints $100.
Double your money, a little sort of small enough to fit on your sewing table.
Right. On your sewing, very important. On your sewing table.
Exactly. And if you just put $100 in, it will spit out $200. And he was selling them all around South Boston at the same time that Ponzi was operating. And there were these kinds of schemes going on all over for the very reason you describe. That it's 1920 and people are eager to put aside the old penny saved is a penny earned ethos. Right. Now it's the dawn of modern America. It's the dawn of a time when the best money comes in large quantities and comes fast.
And Ponzi's scheme was to tell people that he could double their money in usually 3 months.
90 days, yes.
90 days. And behind it, and your book gets into this wonderfully.
Thank you.
There's a scheme about he's really going to be able to satisfy all his customers, get them their
every
money
last one,
by some kind of stamp business.
This is the thing. When people hear Ponzi scheme, they think of it as purely a scheme, a rip-off artist idea.
Right.
But Ponzi set out with actually both a legal and an, on paper at least, possible investment idea.
There's a moment in your book where you have a statement, and it's legal, exclamation point.
Yeah, exactly. the best part of all, what he wanted to do was go over to Europe and buy these international reply coupons. It was an obscure postal currency that simply was more valuable here than it was over in Europe, and he could use exchange rates to turn it into enormous profits. If you could actually figure out how to get them from Europe to here and turn them to cash, you could get easily 500% return on these.
And you would have to know where the devaluation would make it, whether it be Romania or Italy or Spain or something like that.
That's right. And
it sounds a hell of a lot like oil futures to me.
It does. I think the guys from Enron figured this out as well a little bit late.
There's a date in the book, July 24th, 1920, and you describe a mass of people closing in on his office at 27 School Street. And at this particular moment, it's a time when he doesn't want to take any more money.
Yeah. This is at once the greatest day of Ponzi's life and also the most frightening day of Ponzi's life. He's achieved, it seems, the great success that he had spent all 38 of his years seeking. And he's on the front page of the Boston Post with people describing how he was going to double their money in 90 days, and people are coming out of the woodwork, and yet he knows at the same time he's got an ulcer building because he realizes with every dollar he takes in, he goes further into debt. So he would love nothing more than to stop and figure out a way to dig out from the problem, but he just can't.
There aren't many people who have that problem. It's
true.
It's really, and at the same time he's got that problem, folks are bearing down on him.
Indeed.
The Boston Post and the DA and some state authorities and so on.
Yes,
He's
state,
really
federal,
squeezed.
local, everybody's coming after him. They're bringing in Clarence Barron, the great financial journalist, the Wall Street Journal owner, and everybody's coming after him because nobody can believe it's possible to double your money in 90 days. And they are set out to, and only, at this point, only one can survive, either Ponzi or the other guys.
And that's it. It's war.
It is war.
It's war. Charles Ponzi, he's short, he's dapper, he's a fast talker, and he's fast becoming a major financial figure. Who was he? Where did he come from? We'll answer some of those questions when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Ponzi Scheme, the true story of a financial legend. That's the book we're talking about today. And we're talking with the author, Mitchell Zuckoff, who comes to us all the way from Boston.
Indeed.
And the book is published by Random House. And a fellow by the name of Howard Frank Mosher,
Yes.
who wrote a book called he's the author of Waiting for Teddy Williams. He says, Ponzi Scheme reads like a wonderful character-driven novel, with the larger-than-life con man, Charles Ponzi, at its center. Mitchell Zuckoff gets it all exactly right, from the mean streets of Prohibition-era Boston to what was and still is best and worst about our capitalistic system. This is the best pure read about American dreams and nightmares since The Devil in the White City.
Wasn't that nice of him?
It's very nice, and I agree with it. I think he has it right, because Ponzi is at the center of things here. But to me, given his background, it's all highly unlikely.
It is.
He's an immigrant from Italy.
Yes.
And when he gets to this country, he's qualified only for the meanest jobs, the kinds of things that we know from reading any kind of history book that immigrants tend to get.
That's right.
Okay? And
he works as a road drummer. He works as a waiter. He works in the most menial tasks imaginable from the time he arrives in 1903 for more than a decade.
But part of his experience is prison time in Canada for bank violation.
Yes. He goes up, after a while, he's a very bright guy, and he picks up the language, and he picks up skills, and he goes up to Canada and starts working in a bank, an Italian-American bank there. And this is where he first sees the rob Peter to pay Paul scheme in action.
Right.
And the bank, it's called Banco Zarossi, and the bank owner is basically ripping off his own customers. And Ponzi watches, doesn't participate, but when things start to collapse, Ponzi writes himself a check from one of the accounts, and as a little bit of traveling money, you might say.
Yeah, well,
and
you got to be on the road. You got to have
you should have a few in your pocket.
Yeah,
and,
right.
He quickly bought some clothes with the money, and he was quickly caught and spends a couple years in prison for a bad check passing.
Right.
And immediately upon getting out, he gets sent back to prison because he brings some Italian immigrants with him back over the border to the United States.
I thought that was a lousy charge.
I agree with you.
I really do. I don't think he did anything wrong.
I agree with you. And the borders were so permeable back then, and they nailed him for no good reason. That was not a reasonable prison term.
He winds up in a federal pen
in Atlanta.
In Atlanta.
Yes.
And then he eventually gets to Boston, and he's on his feet. And I asked myself the question, how? And I think there's an answer here. And he says, or you say, Ponzi held the note, the international reply coupon. That has to do with the stamps. He held the note in his soft hands. In a spark of inspiration, he saw a glittering future spread out before him. Everything up to this point in his life, from major events to chance encounters, from his never-quit persistence to his unquenched thirst for wealth, had led to this moment. It had its roots in his upbringing and his spendthrift youth, his dashed expectations of gold in American streets, and his jobs in banking and exporting. It could be traced to his stretches in prison and the men he'd met there, his acts of generosity. My goodness, he gave a bunch of skin to a woman he didn't know.
That's exactly right.
Victim. It's an incredible story that he would do that.
Yes.
His return to Boston, his passion for stamp collecting, his memories of his father, the postman, his chance meeting with foreign exchange expert Roberto de Michelis, all of this made it possible for him to see what no one else could, to dream what no one else dared. Now, that is a wonderful portrait.
Thank you.
Of a guy you have to like.
I agree.
And I started reading the book, say, this guy is a con man. I'm not going to like him.
Yeah. For 85 years, the name Ponzi has been mud. This was a guy who will take your money, take your mother's money, and run. It was the image people had. A Ponzi scheme. It was synonymous with swindle.
Right. Right.
But what I found out, and I love the passage you just read, because it does show there was a much more complex character here. There was a guy who was willing to be a hero for a woman he didn't know. And this was a guy who was not just a one-dimensional fraud or a con artist. You know, the key of this is there's two parts to a swindle. There's take the money and run. There was no and run.
There was no run.
Ponzi.
Right. That's the thing that I couldn't get over. That, you know, he had a chance as he was getting all this money with the promise of doubling the money in 30 days. He had a lot of chances to run, and he never ran. And he kept trying to find a way to make it all legal,
to make good on his promise. That was his goal.
Oh, well, Charles Ponzi's scheme is incredibly successful. But there is a downside. At one point, each dollar Ponzi accepted put him deeper in debt, as we talking before. Now, how does that happen? I don't know, but we're going to find out after these messages.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast. Today, our guest is Mitchell Zuckoff, and he is here to talk about a book that I find totally fascinating. It's called Ponzi Scheme, The True Story of a Financial Legend. A man by the name of Mike Stanton, who wrote a book called The Prince of Providence, says, "It is hard not to root for Ponzi." Yay! As he tiptoes along a financial high wire of his own creation, high above his immigrant investors cheering him on, and the Boston Brahmins hoping for him to fall. Boo! Zuckoff spins a tale rich in intrigue, corruption, betrayal, and love. It is a story that resonates today, in an age of financial scandals ranging from Enron to Martha Stewart. Which leads me to ask the question, Ponzi, Enron, Martha Stewart, do they kind of go together?
Well, I want to leave Martha out a little bit, but Enron, absolutely. Enron, it was a giant Ponzi scheme. One of the experts, Kurt Eichenwald of the New York Times, has described it that way brilliantly. You had basically no there. You had them claiming they were trading in some kind of obscure securities, weather securities or energy securities, but they weren't doing anything of the sort. They were pretending to do that, and all the while expecting the stock to rise, but there was nothing underneath.
Yeah, to rise on false information.
Precisely.
Which it did.
Yes. It was the seventh biggest company in the country. It was a giant Ponzi scheme. And that's why this story, to me, does resonate today.
To say nothing of what Enron did to the state of California.
Oh, horrible. Horrible. And the victims are multitudes of them. You know,
I think you make Ponzi a sympathetic, charming, totally fascinating character. Guy. I mean, or am I just part of the get-rich quick crap? I mean,
You've been taken in?
Have you seduced me?
Jim, that $100 you gave me before, I'll be back to you in 45 days with $150.
Oh, okay.
That's who Ponzi was. I don't think you've been taken in. I think he was a complex character who was charming, who was desperately in love with his wife, Rose, who was a good husband, who wanted for her. All she wanted was him home in time for dinner. But he wanted her draped in finery,
right?
And he wanted to get rich to do it for her.
But one of the things he got involved in was the Boston mayoral politics. And a fellow by the name of Curley was running against a fellow by the name of Honey Fitz.
Yeah, James Michael Curley, and
Curley,
the Kennedy family.
Curley decided that he had to get Fitz out of the race.
Yeah,
and he did by digging up not a little, but a woman called what?
Toodles.
Yes, Toodles. He was.
This was Boston in the 19th.
He was dallying with Toodles.
Yes, and they quickly turned it into a rather ribald ditty about Toodles and honey, and this was hardball politics. Boston was a Wild West city to some extent politically back then, and rogues and rascals abounded, and so Ponzi came up.
Well, and the whole thing is that Honey Fitz coming forward is connected with Kennedy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what I love about that connection is, there are a lot of people who have in their own family pasts some rogues, some people whose stories, whether it was because they were smuggling liquor during Prohibition or what have you, made money not a completely legitimate way.
Yeah.
Ponzi expected to be one of those. Okay, I'll fudge a little bit here, but I'm going to turn legit, and I'm going to be a pillar of the community. I'm going to be a Kennedy.
One of the things he said of himself was, "I was the realization of their dreams."
Exactly.
That
he understood that.
That's idealism to the nth degree. It seems to me. There were many reasons to love this guy. One of them is the way he went to the district attorney's office.
Yes.
En route, Ponzi looked more like a man going to a cotillion than to the gallows, having dressed that morning as sharply as ever in white flannel trousers, silk shirt and socks, white bucks, and a blue coat with a handkerchief poking from the breast pocket. A large diamond pin glinted from the center of his cravat, and a silver-topped walking stick was tucked under his arm. He felt as good as he looked. What a way to go to court!
Isn't that the way? Shouldn't we all go down that way?
I think so.
I mean, so.
That to me that makes a lot of sense. And there's the other thing that the listeners should know is there's a tenderness here. And here it is in an epilogue in a strange place. Ponzi settled quickly into his new home, cell 126 at the Plymouth County Jail, a concrete monolith with $1 million view. He returned to the jailhouse routine familiar to him from Montreal and Atlanta. And somehow that suggests to me that despite of where he is, this man is at peace.
He absolutely was. He felt like he tried as hard as he could and did the best he could.
It's been a great journey to get to that peace, and the journey is captured here beautifully in a book called Ponzi'sscheme, The True Story of a Financial Legend. The author is Mitchell Zuckoff, and he's been good enough to talk to us today on Conversations on the Coast.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.